Alright guys, so this is going to act as our 2025 pesticide training. That's our annual training. I pretty much just took the presentation I gave to the new class and I put some other information in there and try to make it a little bit more interesting, but trying to take a new approach to it from last year, keep you guys interested. Maybe you'll learn something a little bit different, or maybe you'll be reminded of something that you'd forgotten. So it is important to note that our pesticide training, and one of the reasons that we need to do it, is that it fits into our Florida-friendly landscaping principles under the guise of managing our yard pests responsibly. Now, we do use an IPM structure for that, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But pesticides are one of the things that we use to manage our yard pests responsibly, and it does fall into the Florida-friendly landscaping program. Since I'm a Florida-friendly landscaping agent, that's important. So I just want you guys to know that we're not just doing this just to do it. They are a critical tool, pesticides are, in the IPM construct. There is a lot of misconceptions running around about chemicals. There are a lot of people that don't believe in ever using any amount of chemical control in their yard ever. There are a lot of people out there that are like that. It's important for you guys to understand what they are and how to effectively use them and how to effectively apply them. It's also important for you guys to understand that there's nothing wrong with using chemicals in your yard. It's just a tool. And so they're going to be something that's around, and it's a methodology for controlling pests in your yard. You guys are in a unique position as Master Gardener volunteers, is that you're going to be able to advocate for these pesticides, and you're going to have to, on occasion, recommend them. This training is meant to give you a strong basis for that, give you a strong understanding of what they are and why they're used and when they should be used, versus just saying willy-nilly, we're going to put them out just to put them out. So that's kind of the purpose of this training. So before we get into what pesticides are and what they do, let's get into a little bit of what a pest even is. It is any organism which is destructive to the plant life or a nuisance to the gardener, including but not limited to weeds, of course. We've all been in the situation, particularly if you've worked in the demo gardens out here, where we just have weeds galore and we need to get rid of them. Anybody that's ever been in that situation understands the nuisance that weeds can be. Algae, of course, is going to be a big one. In overly watered areas, you're going to start to get algae, and then things get gross, they look bad, they get slimy. It's a pest, it's a nuisance. Fungi, of course, creates a lot of plant diseases. It is one of our main three pathogens. It is responsible for 85% of the pathogens in this area. So understanding what it is and how to combat it is, of course, a great thing to know, because it's something you're definitely going to come up against. Insects, this is North Florida. We do have a lot of insects, maybe not quite as bad as they have down south in the tropical portions of Florida, but even up here we do get a lot of different insect species, and a lot of them are bad, and a lot of them create havoc in your gardens. Of course, that's not all of them. Something like 99% of insects don't really do anything to your gardens, but the 1% that do really do make a big impact. And so it's important to know how to control them. Nematodes are, of course, that's the middle picture here between the rat and the leaffoot bug. Nematodes are, of course, a generally soil-borne pest in your gardens. They're a lot more difficult to control. There's not a whole lot of chemical controls for them. So understanding the cultural practices to keep them out of your gardens is a big deal. But we're not really going to talk about nematodes today. That's a whole other class on its own. And then, of course, some things that people never really think about is some of the wildlife that can get in your gardens. Now, I have rodents on here, but it's certainly not limited to just rodents. We have big deer problems here in the extension gardens. We have had to take methodologies and active resistance to those deer to try to keep them out and scare them away. That's why we have the motion censored irrigation heads out there. They are designed to control and frighten those deer away so that the deer run and they no longer think that our garden is a great place to get a meal. But that's just a few examples of some things that are considered pests. There are a bunch of other things that exist in gardens that are not necessarily considered pests. The big one of those being things like slime molds. Yes, they're unattractive. Yes, they don't. It's not something people necessarily want. There's not really any chemical controls for them. The best you can do is just take a shovel and then chuck it into the woods. But I would not consider a slime mold and things of that nature to be a pest per se. It's just not something that's a big deal. It's just something that happens and you get rid of it, you just shovel it away, or you put dirt on it and cover it up. It's not a big deal. These other things are going to actively harm the plants in your gardens or eat them so you can't. So when do we apply our pest control to our different species? So in the agronomic world, there is a concept called the economic injury level. What that refers to is the price it's going to cost to treat the insect versus the amount you're going to get back for your crop. So essentially, as long as you're going to continue to get back more for your crop than it's going to cost you to treat the pest, most farmers won't mess with the pest at all. It's just not worth it to them to do so. So that's for agronomic fields though, and that's for farmers. As far as homeowners, it really is a matter of, do they like what's going on in their gardens? So has it hit a level that bothers them to the point where they feel they need to treat it? That's kind of where we're at with it versus where a farmer would be at with it. And that can be, somebody might not want to have a single leaf bitten in their entire garden, and somebody might not care until everything's just eaten to the ground. You're going to have to work with the client. You're going to have to figure out what their level of acceptable is, and then you're going to have to help them walk through how to treat so that they don't hit their level of acceptance. Now, there are 3 strategies for approaching pest control. The first one is prevention. That is by far the best one. It is going to keep you from ever having these problems in the first place. That one is going to rely heavily on your cultural controls to keep these things out of your garden in the first place. The second one is suppression. And so I want to talk a little bit about suppression. Suppression is keeping the insect level below what is acceptable to the homeowner, not necessarily going out there and trying to kill every single organism that you can possibly find just because the homeowner doesn't like it. When we're suppressing the species, we're keeping that species to a level where they're not causing so much damage that it's bothering the homeowner, but not completely getting rid of them. Completely getting rid of them would be this last methodology, which is eradication. That's going to cost you a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money. And by the time you've done all those things, your neighbor has not necessarily done all of those things, and those insects are going to come right back, or those weeds are going to come right back. So eradication is really not the best strategy, but it is a strategy, and you're probably going to have some homeowners that come to you and say, I want all of them gone. Okay, you're going to have to then talk to them and say, okay, so let's calculate about how much it's going to cost you to get all of them gone, and then maybe talk a little bit about why there's some other better methodologies for doing this. But the prevention, suppression, and eradication are the 3 accepted strategies. So methods of pest control. Of course, we rely heavily on integrated pest management for this. It's a staple in Extension. You guys all know that. We teach classes specifically on IPM for that purpose. It's just a sustainable 4-pronged approach to managing pests while minimizing risk to the surrounding environment. We take several approaches to it. What we're looking for is anything we can do to prevent chemical controls, because we don't want those pests to develop a resistance to what we're doing. We also want to create habits that create long-lasting pest control, and then we want a consistent pest control. Those things are all important because the better habits we can create, the better gardening habits we can create, the less issues people will have, because they won't be overwatering, they won't be over-fertilizing, they won't be creating stressed plants that then have insects come and attack them. So the better habits we can create, the better pest control they can have. The less chemicals we can use, the more effective those chemicals will remain to be, and the more consistent we can be. It's just better long-term strategy. So let's quickly go over what the methods of control are. We'll go over mechanical controls first, which is just the physical removal of a pest species from the landscaped area. It does include exclusion, so there is a part in there where you're going to put up fences to keep those deer out. That would be considered a mechanical control. But for our purposes, things like hand pulling weeds, we're going to want to make sure that we don't shallow cultivate. We're going to want to make sure that we get right down to the roots and get the roots out of there, because the roots are where the plant is going to come from. And if we leave that there, the weed's going to come right back. So make sure you're getting those roots out. Make sure you're getting everything out when you hand pull weeds. Another example would be dropping caterpillars into soapy water. You're going to physically remove, you personally are going to hold on to that insect, pull it off of the plant, and drop it into a bucket of soapy water. I get asked quite often why soapy water. It keeps them from crawling back out. And so they're not going to just go back and reinfest everything. They didn't just quickly get a drink and now they're going to go back to doing what they're doing. The soapy water keeps them from climbing out and takes them out of your system. You can also spray smaller insects with a hose and wash them off. You see that most often with milkweed when people are trying to get rid of aphids. That's a very common methodology for that. It is considered a mechanical control because you are actively doing something to remove that pest. And therefore it is a mechanical control, not a cultural control. So as far as cultural controls, these are your gardening practices and how you treat your garden and landscape spaces to interrupt those pest life cycles. So what we're really looking at is habitat. If we can eliminate the habitat that those insects like, if we can get rid of that, we can prevent them ever showing up in the first place. Using the right plants. So we're not going to have a plant that's in the wrong spot that's going to be stressed the entire time because it's in the wrong spot and it's trying to grow and you keep cutting it back, or it can't grow because it's not getting the light that it needs. Make sure that your plants are in the right spots when you plant them. Make sure that they're in the right place, that they're going to be treated appropriately. Fertilization and irrigation, those are probably the two biggest cultural controls that we have. Almost every plant in Florida is over irrigated. People forget that the methodology for water to move through a plant, it all happens in the top half, or that half millimeter section above the leaf, where if that bit of air can accept more liquid into it, water will move through that plant. So when we get into these real hot, humid summers and people are just watering and watering and watering because they think that the plant needs all that water, all they're doing is keeping that water in the root zone, which is rotting the roots, which is affecting the plant. So water, irrigation and fertilization are two really big ones as far as cultural controls are concerned. Everything should be watered and fertilized appropriately, not over, not under, to keep everything healthy and happy and keep it stress-free. Stress-free plants don't have the insect problems, don't have the weed problems that other plants do. Another methodology that's considered a cultural control is either using trap crops or banker plants. So trap crops are what you see on the left picture here, and that is buckwheat that is put into a squash system. The idea being that the insects will go after the buckwheat, not the squash, which can then either be chemically treated and you can keep your squash chemical free, or it can be completely removed from the field at that point once the insect's infected, and you can keep those insects off of your squash. So that would be a concept of a trap crop. On the right side picture here, we have what's considered a banker plant. All that banker plants do is they create habitat and they create a space for a beneficial insect to be. So in this case, it's papaya trees that are inside of a tomato forest. I think that they're a tomato greenhouse. I think what they're going for here is they're trying to keep the ladybugs on the papaya tree when they don't feel like they have anything to eat on the tomatoes until those tomatoes get reinfested, and then the ladybugs are already there and they can go back out to the tomatoes and cure that problem. So this one kind of crosses the line between biological and cultural controls, but it is considered a cultural control. Now, biological control is by far the funnest one. This is where you're going to use nature against itself. You're going to use natural enemies to the pest you'd like to prevent. So, for instance, these leaf-footed bugs over here in their larval stage, if you had some ladybugs or maybe some lacewings in your garden area, they would go and they would eat them at the larval stage, and you would eliminate that insect naturally without you having to do anything. So, as you can expect, biological controls come in the form of predatory insects, parasitoids, which if you don't understand what a parasitoid is, that is most often they're wasps, and they go out and they lay their babies on the bugs you don't want. Those eggs then hatch and they eat that and eliminate that insect from your system. That would be a parasitoid. You can also use bacteria and fungi as a biological control. Bacteria, the most common one would be Bt, which actually is a bacteria. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's considered a biochemical control. But it is a bacteria that affects caterpillars and keeps them and clogs them up, and basically they die of constipation. But it is considered a biological control because it's a bacteria, it's a biological entity that's making that happen. Fungi, there's a lot of them out there. There's a zombie fungus that infects ants and makes them climb up trees and then stretch out so that the wind can hit the fungus and spread its spores. It's kind of a cool one. There's other ones that can happen. There's other beneficial fungi out there that can infect different insects and take them out in different ways. Just so you know, these are not super common. Well, the BT is, but the fungal ones are not super common, but they do exist and they are out there. So finally, for what we're here for today, chemical controls. A chemical control is the use of an herbicide, a pesticide, a fungicide, or a rodenticide. Anything with the word "side" in it is considered a pesticide. Pesticide is the overarching term. But those are all chemical controls. They control pests in your gardens, lawns, and landscapes. A couple of keys about this that I really want you guys to take home is that you want to use the absolute minimum required. You don't want to over flood your area with all these chemicals. You also always want to follow the label, and you always want to use appropriate PPE. What's PPE? Personal protective equipment. That's what Dr. Inlow that's in this picture is out there spraying. You can see that he's got glasses on, he's got long pants on, long shirt on, he's wearing gloves. I'm sure you can't see it, but I'm sure that he's wearing closed-toed shoes as well. He's our invasives guy for a UF, so he knows what he's doing. So he's out there using all of his PPE. So why do pesticides fail? Why do people go out there, they don't understand anything about what they're trying to treat, and they go out there and they treat it with something, and the next thing you know, the bug is still there, the weed is still there, something is still there, whatever their insect or whatever their pest is still there, and they don't understand why. Well, a couple of things could have gone wrong. They could have either failed to outright or incorrectly identified the pest to begin with. If you're using an herbicide on an insect, it's not going to work. If you're using something with an active ingredient that's not rated for that plant or that pest, it's not going to work, which is that second bullet there. You said the incorrect active ingredient. Wrong dosage, wrong application rate. Maybe you mixed your tank a little bit too weak. Maybe you were in a hurry and you sprayed real fast and you walked real fast over everything and it didn't get the level of pesticide that it needed to treat whatever your problem was. Those are both big issues. Maybe you applied it at the wrong time. Maybe it was really hot outside, and despite the label saying don't apply this over 85 degrees, the customer said, well, it's the only time I have to do it, so I'm going to do it, and they applied it and it didn't work. Well, it said to not apply it over at 85 degrees for a reason. That goes back to always reading the label, and maybe you've applied the same thing for so long that now those pests are resistant to it and it's no longer effective. Those are all reasons why pesticides fail, and you're going to need to be able to get to the bottom of that with your clients. So let's talk a little bit about what the chemicals actually are and a couple of different things that you should be aware of when you're recommending chemicals. The first one I want you to be aware of is your signal word. Signal words are what tells you how toxic that chemical is. Most of the time, we are not going to get above this caution level. You're very rarely going to have a client that has even access to those, and we'll go over that in a minute. But you're very rarely going to have anybody that has access to anything higher than that. Those tend to be fairly low toxic. They have an LD50 of 5 to 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. LD50, as it says on the bottom here, is how lethal or how much it takes to kill 50% of the test population. Now I have animals on here, but it's not always animals. But it's 50% of the test population died from that level of exposure. So whether that's monkeys or cockroaches or whatever it is, it's that test population. So obviously the higher you can get that number, the better. As we get up here a little bit higher, we get into the warning stages, and you can see that it's far more lethal. We went from 500 to 5,000 milligrams per kilogram down to 50 to 500. So it's very toxic at that point. And then as we go up, we get even worse. We get into 0 to 50, which means if you look at it, you're probably going to be affected by it. All right, so use classifications. Those bottom two that we talked about on the last slide, the toxicity levels, they're going to be probably considered a general use or not classified pesticide, which means that you do not need a license to get it. These are the ones that you see on the store shelves. You can go buy them today with no license, no problem, and apply them as long as you're using them according to the label. You're going to have these at home. These are not going to be what you see applied to golf courses and things of that nature. You're probably not going to have things like re-entry intervals with these. It's going to be, or you may, but it's probably going to be somewhere in the 30-minute range. Again, on the label. But these are things that anybody can have access to, anybody can get. They're not a big deal. You just go to the store, you buy them. Again, you're going to want to make sure that you're using the correct active ingredient, and you're going to want to make sure that you're using the correct mode of action, which we're going to go over here in a minute. But these are just widely available. On the other hand, we have restricted use pesticides. They are much higher in toxicity. These are those two that we had that were 50 to 500 and 0 to 50. That would be these level of chemicals. They require licensing. You have to come to extension. You have to sit through several 8-hour classes. You have to take a test. You have to do a lot of things to get those licenses. These are the licenses that people like Matt Lawler and I have. So you need to do a lot to get those licenses. They are intended for certified applicators in a commercial environment. It's important to note commercial environment. So that's going to be greenhouses. That's going to be agricultural operations. That's going to be your pesticide control operator. All of those people have had pretty extensive training on how to apply these chemicals and what these chemicals can do and why they need to be wearing gloves and why they need to be wearing eyeglasses and things of that nature. You're not even going to be able to purchase these. They are not available in most stores. The stores that they would be available in, they're going to be in a case behind locked glass, and you're not going to have access to them anyway. It's not something you can just pull off the shelf and go buy. So you're going to have to show your license, and you're going to have to be on record as having gotten these. But it's important to know that pesticides do get to that level. This is not what we're giving our average homeowner. This is not what we're going to be recommending to our average homeowner. So this is kind of where that misconception comes in, because there are chemicals to this level that can be harmful, but that's nothing that we're going to recommend to any homeowners. They do come in synthetic and organic. A synthetic one is going to probably stick a little bit better. It's probably going to last a little bit longer. It might be a little bit more effective versus your organic versions. Organic versions of the pesticide are plant-derived generally, or they're botanical or based on minerals or soaps or oils. You've probably heard people talk about neem oil, which is right here in the picture, or insecticidal soaps, things of that nature. Keep in mind, when we say soaps, we mean insecticidal soaps, not kitchen soaps. And different microbial entities are also fall into this category. One is not necessarily better than the other. It kind of falls into your philosophy on gardening. If you want to stay organic, because yes, people that have an organic certification do also spray. There are pesticides for that. People that are not organic and are just spraying for maximum effect, they may use the synthetic ones because they feel like they work a little bit better. User's choice. It really doesn't matter. It's kind of whatever you feel as the gardener. So, mode of action. Mode of action is going to outline how that pesticide works and what the methodology is behind that pesticide. So, pesticides affect things from different angles and different methodologies. Some of them affect photosynthesis. Some of them affect the hormones of those plants. Some of those can affect the nervous systems, particularly of insects. Some affect leaves, some affect roots, some are soil-borne, some don't have any effect on the roots at all. All of that is outlined in the mode of action. So mode of actions, they are color-coded to help you rotate your pesticides a little bit better. They're numbered for resistance management. The reason is you can have two products that are very similar to one another that have a different mode of action, and then rotating those products will actually help you prevent a lot of that resistance. There is this IRAC, Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. They're the ones that put this little graphic out. If you go to the IRAC online, which my picture is blocking it, but you can Google IRAC online and you'll be able to get to it, and it's going to talk to you all about the different modes of action. So how do we avoid pesticide resistance, and what even is pesticide resistance? So let's say you can see this little graphic right here. You have a bad insect problem and you go ahead and you spray them, and that's the one as you move to the right. Now you see that one of those insects was resistant to it and a couple of them didn't quite get the dose they needed. So that leaves there a little population there to bring back a larger population. Now, as you come back and you see there's a bunch of them in there now that are resistant to that pesticide. So you spray it again. This time it was pretty effective against those that were not resistant, but you see that you left an entire resistant population of those insects still on that leaf. So that's what we're trying to avoid. That's why we need to rotate our modes of action, because what may not have hurt that one the first time, if you rotate the mode of action, may hurt it the second time. So it's going to rarely kill 100% of your target the first time. The survivors are going to pass those resistant genes on to their offspring. If you keep going back with the same one, you're very likely to create a highly resistant population for that pesticide, which is why, again, it's important to rotate your modes of action. For instance, both of these products control the same insect, and they control them very much in the same way. Again, my picture's covering it, but it's a nerve agent. And so one of them is MOA group 4 and one is MOA group 3. And so what they do is they hurt the nerve system of those insects a little bit differently. So one that may have been resistant to the number 4 might not be the resistant to the number 3, or vice versa, if you rotate how you're doing it, which they're essentially the same pesticide. It's just that there's a little bit different on how they work. If you rotate them, you're likely to have a much higher degree of success. When it comes to pesticides, you always, always, always have to read the label. There's a lot of really good information on there. I would read it before you purchase it. I would read it before you mix it. I would read it before you apply it. I would read it before you store it. And I would read it before you dispose of it. It is quite literally the law. You must read and abide by those labels. If you get caught not applying according to the label, you could be held liable for it. Which means ultimately, if you're suggesting it to somebody, we would be held liable for it. So make sure that you emphasize when you talk to people and when you talk to our clients that they must follow the label. So what is on the label? When and how and where to safely apply on it, i.e. is it okay for vegetables? Is it only for ornamentals? Is it only for grasses? Is it only for sedges? Is it only for this? Is it only for that? That will all be on the label. That toxicity level we talked about, those signal words, those will be on the label. Any hazards that you might come across, anything, basically any health hazards that they know these chemicals might create or might exacerbate, will be on there. The personal protective equipment that you need to wear will be on there. How to mix this product, whether it's with water, whether it's with oil, whether it's with whatever, will be on there. How much you need to put on a given area, whether it's turf grass or whether it's gardens or whether it's anything, will be on that label. What happens or what you need to do if you're exposed to that chemical will be on the label. Most often it's going to be just rinse everything away, but that will all be on the label. Some other things that are interesting or important that are going to be on there, days to harvest. In other words, how far from harvesting these can you apply these chemicals? It's not to say that they're necessarily deadly, but you don't necessarily want to eat something that's still on there once after you've applied it. And so it's important to know how many days to harvest. And what that means is if I'm going to harvest 40 days from now and I can apply this up to 30 days prior, then I know I have kind of a 10-day window where I can apply it. The last one is a re-entry interval. Re-entry interval just speaks to how long after application can people and pets go back into that area. So, pesticide selection. You want to know that it's going to be effective against the pest that you're putting it on. So you're going to want to know what that active ingredient is. You're going to want to know what else that active ingredient might affect that's in your yard. For instance, there's a lot of atrazine that is put on different plants as a pre-emergent. Grasses as a pre-emergent, but it can also affect shrubs and trees. And so people will put out atrazine and not realizing they're going to hurt their shrubs and trees. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to what the active ingredient is and what all it hurts and how it works. You're going to want to make sure you do that so that we can recommend something to our clients that's not going to hurt the rest of their yard. Toxicity to human and pets. Again, we're going to be very low level toxicity when we're telling homeowners to go pick these things up, but low level does not mean no toxicity. And so we just need to make sure that we know what it is and that we're telling our clients what the level of toxicity is and what some of those risks are. How easy can you use it? Is it something that is just beyond your scope? Are they asking for micrograms of something and the homeowner has no earthly way of measuring that? That's going to be important. How easy is the product to use? And then the required equipment. If you're going to have to send a client out to buy sprayers and spreaders and all this other stuff just to use this one chemical, maybe that's not the right way to go, or maybe that's not the formulation you want to go with. You have to remember that these things come in granules and they come in liquids and they come in a lot of things. And so you're going to have to talk to your clients and figure out what equipment they have and be able to tell them what formulation they need to get from that equipment that they have. Mixing and applying, we want to follow the label instructions, of course, always. If we underdose, so if we measure things incorrectly, we could very well have something that we put out that's no longer effective because there wasn't enough of it and mixed in with the water or whatever you mixed it with, and it may not work on the pest that you think it's going to work on. Overdosing, on top of being expensive, because these chemicals are expensive, and being wasteful because you use them way more than you need, it's illegal. Every now and again we get a client that will come in and they'll say that whatever nursery they talked to said to double the dose. That's not a recommendation that we make. The recommendation that we make is follow the label instruction. Those are the only words you're allowed to say. Use the methodology. If they're going to say, because I've had this one too, where people will say double the dose and then use it as a drench even though it's a spray. No, that doesn't fly. Use it as a spray. If it's labeled as a spray, use it at the label rate because that is the law. So overdosing is illegal. It's not something we should ever recommend. I don't ever want to hear anybody saying double the dose or even go a little bit higher. It's just not okay. Mixing and applying, some things that we need to worry about. You're never going to apply a pesticide on a high wind day. What we're worried about is drift, which means that the wind takes those little droplets and puts them on something that you weren't going after. That would be called an off-target application. You are spraying things that you didn't mean to spray because you went out there on a day where it was very windy. So we're going to spray with wind less than 5 miles per hour. We're going to spray at a low pressure. That means from your tank. You don't want a really high pressure. You don't want it coming out gangbusters. You want it coming out just enough to coat whatever you need to coat if that's the way you apply it. So don't be at those home sprayers. Don't just be cranking them up so high that it's going to come out like crazy. You want low pressure. We're going to do it in the early morning or late evenings. The reason for that is because those tend to be the least windy times of the day, and they tend to be the cooler times of the day, and a lot of times pesticides have a heat limitation. And so we're worried about getting around that heat limitation or a cold limitation. So we want to make sure that we're applying with no winds and at the right temperature. Something else we're worried about is leaching. Just like your fertilizers, as we put these things on the ground, on the turf grass, on whatever it is, you have porous space in that ground, in that soil, and they have hydraulic water movement. As the hydraulic water movement takes that pesticide, we don't want it running straight through and running out into the local water stream. We want to keep it on the target as best we can. So things to avoid for that would be don't be applying right before a big rainstorm. Don't apply right before your irrigation's set to go off. Apply it according to the label and then water it in or don't water it in based on the label. Again, based on the label. Big rainstorms leads to our third point here. We want to avoid runoff. So if I put down a whole bunch of pesticide and then we get a big deluge of rain like we get here, and it all runs off my house and down my lawn and out into the driveway and then down into the local watershed, that's bad. It takes our stuff, it takes our pesticide off of what we were targeting and puts it on another non-target species. And so that's not what we're looking to do. So make sure that you're applying your pesticides the way the label says, when the label says, how the label says. Okay, now finally, avoiding injury to yourself. There's 3 different types of injuries that happen out there with chemicals, and some of these you may not know about and you may have to sort of play with. But an acute injury means something that's happening right then, right there. Some spilled on your skin or whatever it is, that would be an acute injury. Chronic injury means that you've just had repeated doses of this or repeated exposure to whatever the chemical is or whatever the thing is. Keep in mind, chronic can even be like sun radiation. So if you're constantly getting sunburns, you're at a higher risk for cancer. That would be an example of a chronic problem. But the same thing can happen with pesticides. And then, of course, you might have an allergic reaction to it. And if you do have an allergic reaction to it, you need to know that. That might not be something that you necessarily know going into using that chemical, but it will definitely be something that you know after you use that chemical. Dermal exposure is by far the way that people get it the most. They're not wearing their proper PPE. They're out spraying in flip-flops, they're out spraying in shorts, they're not wearing gloves, they're not wearing glasses, they're not wearing long sleeve shirts. It's extremely avoidable. And so make sure that you are reading that label and make sure that you're using the PPE according to what the label says. Remove any children's toys and pet dishes before you apply it. That one should be fairly obvious, but it does warrant being said. That chemical can get onto those toys, get into those pet dishes, and the next thing you know, you've got a pet that's sick because they drank after you applied a chemical. So make sure that you don't do that. Anything that you're wearing when you apply pesticides should be washed separately and should be washed on a hot setting. So make sure you're wearing old clothes when you go do this, that you don't care if they shrink a little bit. Wash them on the hot setting, and then wash them separately from your other clothes, and then you may want to run that washer for one more cycle just to wash it out a little bit, or if you have a quick wash that you can just run some water through it, is probably not needed, but is going to be a good practice to have. If you do get exposed, so if you have some spills on your skin or you start feeling sick afterwards, go to the hospital immediately. Make sure you take at least the label from that product with you. The hospital's going to need to know what you got exposed to so that they know how to treat you. Another method is once you, and that's a 2222, by the way, that's my head is covering. Florida Poison Control Centers, there's one in Jacksonville, one in Tampa, and one in Miami. If you call, you will likely get the Jacksonville one. They are 24/7. They have medical staff that are trained in poison control and exposure. So if you feel sick after you've applied pesticides, call them immediately. If you don't worry about wasting their time. If you call them and you need them, call them. If you call them and you don't need them, it's just going to be a ha ha ha. Well, I guess I'm a little bit overzealous, but it's better than being harmed. So go ahead and call them, even if you're feeling a little bit sick, even if you're not sure, go ahead and call them. So storage and disposal of your chemicals, and I don't believe this part's on the test, but you still got to listen to me. You're going to want to make sure that you store things in a cool, dry, ventilated location. Obviously, you don't want your kids getting to it. It needs to store in the original container. Don't be this kid over here on the right that's storing it in an old Coke bottle. And then clearly mark any chemicals that are in your, any chemical solutions that are in your cabinet. For instance, there's this spray bottle right here that is an aftermarket spray bottle. I assume that's a chemical that's already been mixed. You need to make sure you're writing what's in that chemical and what's in that bottle on that bottle so that nobody has a chance of picking it up thinking it's something else. Okay, use the container in the appropriate areas and apply it fully if it's needed. If you're only going to use half the container, store it and then use the rest of it later. Anything that you use that touches any pesticides needs to be triple rinsed. And that means you fill it up, dump it out, fill it up, dump it out, fill it up, dump it out. And that's what that means. If you're using a hand carry sprayer, probably your second rinse out, you're going to want to go ahead and pump some air into it and spray through the hose and through the nozzle for at least that tank, or at least a good chunk of that tank. That just makes sure everything's washed out of there and everything's out of the way. There are some chemicals that you're never going to get rid of. So for instance, if you're using a tank that has 2,4-D in it, that tank will be for 2,4-D for the rest of eternity. That does not negate you needing to triple rinse it. That just means that 2,4-D is something that never completely goes away, and so you're going to have to use it for 2,4-D for the rest of its life. There's very few that are like that, but 2,4-D is one. Anything that you have that's in excess, you can either dump out on a known area for pesticide dispersal or back over the affected area that you were spraying for anyway. If you're giving it a little bit extra, you're still applying it at the mixture rate, so that's not really overdosing, but you're going to want to go ahead and do that. You also, if you want to, you can dump the original container. Well, no, you need to dump the original container in a known pesticide removal area. Ours is over here behind the soil. That's where I usually dump them, behind where all those cinder block bricks are. And then never use the product containers or store anything else in them. Once they've been labeled as a pesticide container, they are forever a pesticide container. Okay, that's all I have. This is 40 minutes, but it's 40 minutes on YouTube, so I was trying to keep it a little bit short. I'm going to link the Qualtrics survey into the comments once I get this uploaded to YouTube. So just watch this video and then take that test. I don't think that test is very hard. If you have any questions, you're welcome to come and talk to me about them. If you think that one of the questions is difficult or hard to read, or if you think I maybe didn't get the answer down there, come and talk to me and we will get that worked out. So thanks for attending, and this completes your pesticide training just as quick as that little test is done. Thanks.